The chapel floor had become my enemy. I stood in the doorway watching my brothers kneel for evening prayers, their white mantles pooling around them, their heads bowed in devotion, and I felt the familiar burning in my knees that had not left me in 3 years. The Mamluk mace that shattered my right kneecap at the Battle of La Forbie, the infection that followed and spread to my left knee during the fever-ridden voyage back to France, the surgeon's knife that had carved away corrupted flesh and left me with joints that would no longer bend. All of it conspired to make the simple act of kneeling impossible. I could stand. I could walk, though with a limp that marked me as broken. I could even fight after a fashion, my balance adjusted to compensate for legs that remained stubbornly straight. But I could not kneel, could not assume the posture of humility and supplication that our rule demanded, could not join my brothers in the physical expression of devotion that defined us as much as our white mantles or our vows. Brother Commander Arnaud had seen me hesitating in the doorway, and his face hardened with the familiar disapproval I had learned to expect. He would lecture me again after prayers, would remind me that exceptions breed corruption, that the rule exists for reasons beyond our comfort, that a knight who cannot kneel before God has no place in the temple. I entered the chapel and took my position at the back, standing while others knelt, and I began to pray with words that felt increasingly hollow. My name is Brother Guillaume of Provence, and I had served the temple for 28 years before the injury that transformed me from warrior into liability. I joined the order at 19, a young man burning with certainty about righteousness and holy war, eager to prove myself in defense of the Holy Land and the pilgrims who journeyed there. I spent 15 years in Outremer, fighting in battles large and small, learning that warfare was less about glory than about endurance, that faith was tested more by grinding hardship than by moments of dramatic choice. I was competent rather than exceptional, reliable rather than brilliant, the kind of knight who would never command armies but could be trusted to hold his position and do his duty without complaint. I took pride in that reliability, in being someone my commanders knew they could depend on, in fulfilling my vows through steady service rather than spectacular heroism. The injury at La Forbie ended that comfortable competence, transformed me from reliable to problematic, from asset to burden. The battle itself was a disaster from the beginning. 200 Templar knights and supporting forces facing a Saracen army 5 times our size, trapped in terrain that gave every advantage to the enemy, fighting not because we believed we could win, but because our vows demanded we stand regardless of odds. I remember the chaos of combat, the heat and dust and screaming, the way time seemed to compress and expand unpredictably, moments of crystal clarity alternating with confusion so complete I could barely distinguish friend from enemy. I was fighting on foot, my horse already dead beneath me when the Mamluk warrior appeared from the dust cloud, his mace swinging in an arc I saw but could not avoid. The impact on my knee was a sound I will never forget, a wet cracking like green wood breaking, followed by pain so intense my vision went white. I fell, tried to rise, discovered my leg would not support my weight. The warrior raised his mace for a killing blow, and I prepared to commend my soul to God. But Brother Matthias was suddenly there, his sword taking the Mamluk in the throat, his hands pulling me upright, dragging me toward the dubious safety of our collapsing formation. We lost that battle as we had known we would, lost it completely and catastrophically. Most of our knights died on that field, their bodies left for carrion birds, their service ended in the dust of a foreign land fighting for a cause already lost. I survived only because Matthias refused to abandon me, carried me during the desperate retreat, got me to a ship that sailed for France with the wounded and the broken. The voyage was a fever dream of pain and infection, my knee swelling to twice its normal size, the flesh turning colors that signaled death spreading through my leg. The ship's surgeon wanted to amputate, believed it was the only way to save my life, but I refused, told him I would rather die whole than live crippled. He compromised by cutting away the infected tissue, draining the corruption, binding the wounds with honey and prayers and hope that proved more effective than his medical knowledge. I survived, though the knees that had bent easily my entire life became rigid monuments to damage the surgeon's skill could not repair. By the time we reached France, I had accepted that I would never kneel again, that my body had betrayed some fundamental capacity, that I would need to find a new way to serve or accept that my service was finished. The order was uncertain what to do with me. I could not fight effectively with legs that would not bend, could not ride a horse with any real competence, could not perform the basic physical tasks that combat demanded, but I could read and write, could manage accounts, could train young knights in sword work if not horsemanship, could serve in administrative capacities that required mind more than body. They assigned me to the commandery at Toulouse, gave me responsibility for managing supplies and training schedules, made me useful in ways that did not require kneeling or riding or the physical prowess I had lost. I told myself I should be grateful. Many wounded brothers were simply pensioned off, sent away from the order to live out their days in quiet shame at no longer being whole enough to serve. I had been allowed to remain, to continue wearing the white mantle, to keep the identity that had defined my adult life. But gratitude was complicated by the constant reminder that I was diminished, that I could not participate fully in the communal life that gave our service meaning, that I stood when others knelt and marked myself as separate with every prayer. Brother Commander Arnaud called me to his chambers the evening after I had stood through prayers yet again, and his face was grave as he gestured for me to sit. "Brother Guillaume, we must discuss your situation," he began without preamble. "You have been with us for 6 months since your injury. You perform your administrative duties adequately. You train the young knights with competence. But you cannot kneel for prayers, cannot participate in the full observance of our rule, cannot present yourself as an example of what a Templar knight should be. Some brothers have expressed concern that allowing this exception weakens our discipline, suggests that vows are negotiable, that we accommodate individual limitations rather than demanding conformity to the standards that unite us." He paused, and I waited for the words I knew were coming. The judgment that would end my service and send me away from the only life I had known for 3 decades. "I am inclined to agree with them," he continued. "The rule exists for reasons, Guillaume. It binds us together, ensures we are not merely individuals pursuing personal interpretations of service, but a unified brotherhood following common practices. When we allow exceptions, when we say that some requirements apply to most but not to all, we undermine the foundation of our community." I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and bitter. The first real emotion I had allowed myself in months of careful numbness. "So you would cast me out because my knees were shattered in service to the order?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "You would punish me for injuries sustained defending the very cause we all claim to serve? How is that justice, Commander? How is that honoring the sacrifice brothers make in fulfilling their vows?" Arnaud's expression did not change. "I would not cast you out, Guillaume. I would release you to a monastery where you could live out your days in prayer and contemplation, where your inability to kneel would not be a constant reminder to others that the rule has exceptions, where you could find peace rather than standing at the back of every chapel, feeling your inadequacy." His words stung precisely because they contained truth I had been avoiding. I did feel inadequate, did feel like my presence undermined the unity of brothers who could still kneel, did wonder whether clinging to my place in the order was selfishness rather than dedication. "Give me time," I said, hearing the pleading in my voice and hating it. "Let me find a way to serve that does not require kneeling, that does not make me a problem for the community. I have given 28 years to the temple. Do not take that away because my body was broken in its service." Arnaud was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You have 3 months," he said. "Find a way to serve that justifies your continued presence, that demonstrates your value outweighs the complications your limitation creates. If you cannot do that, you will accept transfer to the monastery at Cluny, where you can live in honor, but not as an active brother of the temple." "Is this acceptable?" I agreed because I had no choice, because refusing would have meant immediate dismissal, because I needed time to figure out how a knight who could not kneel could still prove himself worthy of the white mantle. I left his chambers and walked the halls of the commandery, my mind churning with questions I could not answer. My faith, which had seemed so simple and certain when I was young, now complicated by the reality that devotion could not overcome physical limitation, that wanting to serve was not the same as being able to serve effectively, I spent weeks searching for some answer, some way to make my continued presence valuable enough to justify the exception my body demanded. I threw myself into training the young knights, taught them everything I knew about combat and survival, and the mental disciplines that sustained warriors through hardship. I managed our supplies with meticulous attention, ensured every sword was sharpened and every horse was properly shod and every detail of our material readiness was beyond reproach. I copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, my hand steady even when my knees ached from standing too long, producing texts that were beautiful, even if their beauty could not compensate for my inability to join communal prayers. But none of it felt sufficient. None of it addressed the fundamental problem that I could not kneel, could not participate in the most basic expression of our shared devotion, could not present myself as a full brother when my body betrayed some essential capacity. I began to pray differently, not in the chapel where my standing marked me as separate, but in the gardens where I could speak to God alone, where no one witnessed my inadequacy. And in those solitary prayers I discovered something unexpected, that the posture of my body mattered less than the posture of my heart, that God did not require my knees to bend if my will was surrendered, that devotion was not measured by physical conformity, but by the honesty with which I sought His presence. The revelation came slowly, built across weeks of solitary prayer, of wrestling with anger at my body's failure, and shame at my inability to meet the order's standards, and fear that I would be cast out despite having given my entire adult life to service. I began to understand that I had defined faith too narrowly, had believed that true devotion required specific physical expressions, that God demanded kneeling rather than whatever posture each person could manage. Christ had not required all who came to Him to kneel. He had healed the paralyzed, had blessed those who could not conform to ritual requirements, had suggested that mercy mattered more than sacrifice, that love fulfilled the law more completely than rigid adherence to form. If I could not kneel, perhaps I could serve in other ways, could offer a devotion that was no less genuine for being expressed through different means. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggested my service could continue. Terrifying because it required me to challenge assumptions that were foundational to how the order understood itself. To argue that exceptions were not corruptions, but recognitions of human limitation, that unity did not require uniformity. I went to Brother Commander Arnaud 2 months into the 3 he had given me, and I found him in his study reviewing reports from our holdings across Provence. He looked up as I entered, his expression carefully neutral, and gestured for me to speak. "Commander, I have been thinking about the problem my inability to kneel creates," I began, choosing my words carefully. "You are right that the rule binds us together, that common practices create unity, that we are stronger as a brotherhood following shared disciplines. But I wonder whether we have confused the purpose of those disciplines with the disciplines themselves, whether we have made the means more important than the end. We kneel to humble ourselves before God, to acknowledge our dependence on Him, to surrender our pride and self-sufficiency. But is kneeling the only way to achieve that humility? If my heart is humble, if my will is surrendered, if I come before God knowing I have nothing except what He gives me, does it matter that my body remains standing when my spirit is on its face before His throne?" Arnaud's eyes narrowed, and I could see him weighing my words, testing them against the certainties that had governed his understanding of proper service. "You argue for exception based on your injury," he said slowly. "But if we grant exception for you, we must grant it for others, and soon the rule becomes merely suggestion, individual conscience determining what is required, rather than common discipline binding us to shared standards. Where does it end, Guillaume? If you need not kneel, must another brother fast? If physical limitation excuses you from some requirements, which requirements remain binding and which become negotiable?" I had anticipated this objection, had thought carefully about how to answer it. "I am not arguing that the rule is optional, Commander. I am arguing that the rule's purpose is deeper than its specific prescriptions, that when physical limitation prevents one form of obedience, we should seek another form that achieves the same end. I cannot kneel, so I pray standing. But I pray, Commander. I do not refuse devotion because my body cannot assume the prescribed posture. I find a way to offer devotion that my body can manage. That is not corruption of the rule. It is faithful application of the rule's deeper purpose when surface compliance becomes impossible. I paused, then continued with the argument I had been building for weeks. Christ said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The disciplines of our rule exist to serve our devotion to God, to help us become the people He calls us to be. When those disciplines become barriers to devotion because of circumstances beyond our control, is it not faithful to adapt them rather than abandoning devotion entirely? Arnaud was silent for a long time, and I watched him wrestle with the tension between preserving standards and showing mercy, between maintaining the unity that came from shared practice and acknowledging that broken bodies sometimes required different expressions of the same faith. Finally, he spoke. You make a compelling argument, Guillaume, but arguments are not enough. Show me that praying standing can be as genuine as praying kneeling, that your devotion is not diminished by your inability to conform to common practice, that your service justifies the exception you require. You have 1 month remaining. Use it to prove that faith can survive when the body fails, that God accepts the offering we can make even when we cannot make the offering we wish we could. I thanked him and left, understanding that I had bought time but not resolution, that proving my devotion would require more than words, that somehow I needed to demonstrate that standing prayers could be as faithful as kneeling ones, even though I had no idea how to make that demonstration convincing to men who had spent their lives believing that true humility required physical prostration. The opportunity came unexpectedly, arrived in the form of a crisis I had not anticipated. A group of young knights in training had been sent into the forest to practice wilderness survival, a standard exercise meant to teach self-sufficiency and resourcefulness. They were expected to return after 3 days, but 4 days passed with no sign of them, and search parties found no trace of their passage. Brother Commander Arnaud organized a larger search, but the forest was vast and the trails were numerous, and finding 6 young men who might be lost, or injured, or worse, seemed nearly impossible. I volunteered to join the search despite my limited mobility, and Arnaud accepted reluctantly, assigning me to cover the eastern section where the terrain was less challenging, where my inability to move quickly over rough ground would be less of a liability. I set out at dawn with my horse and my sword and a pack of supplies, and I prayed as I rode. Not the formal prayers of the chapel, but a continuous conversation with God, asking for guidance, for wisdom, for whatever help He might provide in finding these lost young men before injury or exposure or simple misfortune claimed them. I found them on the 2nd day of searching, in a ravine where a bridge had collapsed and left them trapped on the wrong side of a flooding stream, unable to cross back to the path that would lead them home. They were uninjured, but exhausted, frightened, beginning to lose hope that anyone would find them. I called down to them from the ravine's edge, told them help had come, that they would be safe, but getting them out proved more complicated than finding them. The ravine's sides were steep, the stream too swift and deep to cross safely, and my damaged knees meant I could not climb down to them or lead them up the treacherous slope. I had to devise another solution, had to use rope and the strength of my horse to create a system that would pull them up one at a time, had to stand at the ravine's edge for hours guiding each young man safely to the top while praying continuously that the rope would hold, that my horse would not spook, that my failing body would not give out before all 6 were rescued. It was exhausting work, every muscle straining, my knees screaming in protest at the constant shifts of weight and balance. But I kept praying and working, until the last young knight was safe on solid ground. We made our way back to the commandery slowly, the rescued knights weak from their ordeal but alive and grateful. And when we arrived, Brother Commander Arnaud met us at the gate. The young men told him what had happened, how I had found them when others had not, how I had devised a rescue that succeeded despite my physical limitations, how I had prayed constantly while working to save them. Arnaud listened with an expression I could not read, then dismissed the young knights to the infirmary for examination and rest. He turned to me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something like respect in his eyes. "You prayed standing while you worked?" he asked. I nodded. I prayed standing because I could not kneel, but I did not stop working to pray or stop praying to work. The prayer and the work became the same thing, Commander. My body did what it could while my spirit remained before God's throne asking for help I desperately needed. He studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Perhaps I have been wrong about what prayer requires. Come to the chapel this evening. I would speak with all the brothers about what you have shown me." That evening, Brother Commander Arno gathered the entire commandery in the chapel, and he spoke with unusual vulnerability about his own assumptions, about how he had believed that true prayer required specific physical postures, that devotion was measured by conformity to external practices, that exceptions to the rule inevitably led to corruption. "But Brother Guillaume has shown me something I had not understood," he continued. "He has demonstrated that prayer is not primarily about our posture, but about our attention. Not about whether we kneel or stand, but about whether our hearts remain turned toward God regardless of what our bodies are doing. He prayed standing while rescuing our lost brothers, prayed continuously while working tirelessly, and his prayers were answered in ways that should cause us all to reconsider what we have believed about devotion's requirements." He turned to address me directly. "Brother Guillaume, you need not stand at the back of our chapel. You need not feel shame at your inability to kneel. Your prayers standing are as acceptable to God as any brother's prayers kneeling, perhaps more acceptable because they are offered despite the cost, because they require you to surrender pride and simply do what you can rather than what you wish you could do. Will you join us at the front of the chapel? Will you pray standing among your brothers? Will you help us all remember that faith survives when bodies fail, that God accepts what we can offer even when we cannot offer what tradition prescribes?" I moved to the front of the chapel with tears running down my face, stood among my kneeling brothers, and I prayed with a freedom I had not felt since my injury. The words came easily now, no longer hollow but filled with the certainty that God heard. That my standing was not separation, but simply a different expression of the same devotion that filled this sacred space. Over the following weeks, something shifted in how the commandery understood prayer and service and the relationship between physical capacity and spiritual devotion. Brothers who had been injured but remained able to serve began to speak more openly about their limitations, began to find ways to adapt practices rather than abandoning them, began to understand that the rule served us rather than us serving the rule, that faithfulness meant seeking the purpose behind practices and finding ways to achieve that purpose even when the traditional means became impossible. And I discovered that praying standing was not merely accommodation for my failure, but a different path to the same destination, a way of approaching God that was no less valid for being born from necessity rather than choice. I am an old man now, past 70. My knees no better than they were 40 years ago when the Mamluk's mace shattered them at La Forbie. I have spent 4 decades praying standing, 4 decades demonstrating that devotion does not require specific postures, 4 decades teaching young knights that faith is not about conforming to external standards, but about maintaining connection with God regardless of what our bodies can or cannot do. The order has changed in small ways because of my injury, and my refusal to accept that inability to kneel meant inability to serve. We make more room now for brothers whose bodies have been broken in service. We recognize that adaptation is not corruption, but faithfulness expressed through different means. We understand that unity comes not from uniformity, but from shared purpose pursued through whatever capacities each brother possesses. My legacy is not battles won or enemies defeated, but a slightly more merciful understanding of what devotion requires, a recognition that God accepts the offering we can make even when that offering looks different from what tradition prescribes. I tell this story now to those who struggle with bodies that fail, with limitations that seem to disqualify them from service, with the gap between what they wish they could offer and what their circumstances allow. I tell them that I could not kneel, but I prayed standing, that my devotion was no less real for being expressed through a posture born from necessity, that God heard my prayers and used my broken body to rescue lost young men and to teach a commandery about mercy and adaptation and the difference between the letter and the spirit of faithful service. The battle that wounded me was lost. The Holy Land was eventually abandoned. The cause I fought for proved futile by any worldly measure, but the injury that seemed to end my useful service became the beginning of a different service, a witness to the truth that faith survives when bodies fail, that prayer continues when traditional forms become impossible, that God's grace is sufficient even for those who cannot kneel. That is enough. It has always been enough. And it will be enough for you who read this centuries after I have gone to whatever reward or judgment awaits. For you who face your own limitations and wonder whether God can use broken vessels. For you who stand when others kneel and fear that your difference marks you as inadequate. Stand and pray. Offer what you can offer. Trust that the God who made you knows your limitations and values your faithfulness more than your conformity. Non nobis Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to thy name give glory. I have spoken these words standing for 40 years, have proven they are no less true when offered by rigid knees than by bent ones, have discovered that glory belongs to God, regardless of the posture from which we acknowledge it. Pray standing if you must. Pray kneeling if you can. But pray, and trust that God hears and accepts and uses our devotion regardless of its form, that broken bodies do not disqualify us from service, that limitations can become opportunities to discover that faith is deeper and more resilient than we imagined when we were young and whole, and certain that devotion required specific postures we assumed we would always be able to maintain.